Hi and welcome to today's session. It's the first session we're having for our live learnings across the year. We've got a great guest speaker, so it's very exciting to get started with Michael. So just as an introduction, my name's Karen Mosley. I'm the Director of Professional Standards and Complaints, and I'll be facilitating the session. Kat Beavers, our Communications Manager, who was just helping out before, will also be assisting through the session. If you have any questions or you need any support, anything's going wrong, please reach out to us through the chat. Kat and I will both keep an eye on that. I recognise that I'm facilitating this session from the Bundjalung country and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining from today. We honour the First Nations peoples, culture and connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today's session is our first session, as I mentioned, and I'm pleased to introduce our first presenter, Professor Michael Salter. Michael is a Professor of Criminology at the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales and is an expert in child sexual exploitation and gendered violence. Michael's session today will focus on the prevalence and characteristics of male child sex offenders in the Australian community. While Michael will be doing a lot of the talking in the start, we do want to hear from you. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat throughout the session. We'll collate the questions and then towards the end, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session where we can present them to Michael to answer. We'll do it that way just so it's a little bit easier with the number in here and also to make sure we're not asking the same questions. So we'll collate them in that way. As I mentioned, it is being recorded today and then this will be available on our live learning platform in the coming days. Hopefully that timeframe is not too tight for Kat to get it up. So if you think that it was a valuable session and you can think of anybody in your teams or anyone you work with that would really benefit from it, then it would be something that could be shared with them through that platform. With all that being said, I'd like to welcome Professor Michael Salter for his presentation.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks to ACSL for the chance to speak to you today, and thanks everyone for coming along. I really appreciate it. As Karen mentioned, I'm a professor at University of New South Wales. I'm also the chair of the Grace Tame Foundation. So the remit of the foundation is really focused on prevention and education around child sexual abuse. And it's also relevant to mention that I'm the immediate past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. So in addition to my work around child sexual abuse and violence against women, I'm really interested in treatment and clinical work with child and adult survivors of child sexual abuse. And I suppose what are the opportunities at a policy and practice level to support survivors to recover and to heal from child sexual abuse. I was also an expert advisor to the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse. So I have, during the process, the Royal Commission really had the chance to do some real deep dives, I suppose, into some of the institutional challenges around child safeguarding and preventing sexual abuse in institutional settings. And I think the project today that we're going to talk about is very germane to that challenge. I'll just share my screen. So we're talking today about a survey that I've undertaken with colleagues over the last couple of years. This was a collaboration between my research team and Stop It Now Australia, which is a pilot program run out of Jesuit Social Services in Melbourne. Stop It Now is a program that's very well established in the United Kingdom, and it's a service for people who are concerned about their sexual feelings and behaviours towards children. JSS has been a big advocate for this form of intervention in Australia. It's done a lot of work to establish it and is now effectively running it as a pilot, waiting on a large Commonwealth tender process that's still underway, and it's been quite delayed. But Matt and Georgia were really key collaborators with us on this project, and I think their frontline experience was really important. So you might have seen some of the media coverage of this survey, which we released late last year, which received quite a lot of attention, both Australia and in Australia and globally. This was the first large-scale attempt to measure rates of perpetration of child sexual abuse amongst men in the Australian community. led by myself and my colleagues across a number of universities, and also, as I mentioned, JSS. The project was guided by input right across the sector, including from public servants, law enforcement. The study was funded by Westpac, and some of you might know that the financial intelligence units within the finance sector actually do a lot of work to interrogate their banking data sets in order to identify online child sex offending amongst their customers. So in particular, looking for evidence of live streaming of abuse and men paying for live streaming of abuse, and also evidence of traveling sex offenders. And so Mark Dixon from Westpac was really useful and important for us in this project in terms of helping us to include questions in the survey that really came from some of his frontline experience, also the Safety Commissioner and civil society as well. So just to give a bit of background to the study, in general, I think over the last 5 years, last 5 or 10 years, both in Australia and globally, increasing recognition that our response to child sexual abuse has been pretty organic, pretty unplanned, pretty spontaneous, and sort of post hoc. Most of our investment in responding to child sexual abuse is at the tertiary end. So that's intervening, detecting offenders, locking them up, treating them once they're in prison, and also providing services to victims and survivors. Not to suggest for a moment that we have our policy settings for victims and survivors right. We don't, and many survivors struggle to get their basic needs met, but it's been a pretty scattershot response to child sexual abuse. And so increasing interest over the last 5 or 10 years in developing a more structured, evidence-based response to CSA. In terms of the evidence to inform that response, our data is limited. We've had 40 years of quite robust victimisation surveys where we go out to the community and we ask people whether they were sexually victimised in childhood. And that data is very good. It tells us how many survivors are in the community. It tells us what their outcomes are and what their needs are. But our data on perpetrators has been limited essentially to the men that we catch. And we know that the men that we catch are not representative of child sex offenders as a whole. We catch a very small minority of people that harm children. And by definition, it means that we don't know much about the men that we don't catch, and the men that we don't catch are the ones that are good at not being caught. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. So broadly, there's a lack of information for evidence-based policy and practice, and it's very difficult to resolve long-standing debates and controversies in the field. If you look at the forensic psychology literature, there's lots of typologies of child sexual abuse offenders. You know, this is a contact offender and he's distinct from an online offender. You know, here's a child sexual abuse material offender, but he's different from this type of offender. Or we've got an extrafamilial offender and that's different from an incest offender. But these typologies actually contradict each other and they're quite a poor match with victim report. You know, most victims of child sexual abuse, when they're talking about the behavior of their offenders, it's not matching up very well with what forensic psychologists are seeing in clinical settings. Financial institutions at the moment, as I mentioned, they're targeting live streaming of abuse and payments for live streaming, and they're targeting men who appear to be traveling for the purpose of abusing children in low-income countries. But there's a range of online forms of child sexual abuse that would have some sort of financial footprint, but at the moment, financial institutions don't have the data that would allow them to look in more detail at what's going on from a banking point of view. There's been a lot of interest, both here in Australia and overseas, in early intervention for people with sexual feelings towards children, but we don't know a lot about who they are, where they are, how to identify them. We also don't know really what are the odds. If someone says that they have sexual feelings towards children, what are the odds that they have offended? That's been unclear for a long time. So I won't go through this in detail, but it's just a summary of efforts over the last 10 years to try and use different methodologies in order to do research with undetected offenders in the community, or to do research with men who have some sexual interest in children. These surveys have tended to either to have small samples or convenient samples. So the survey's online, and anybody who wants to can fill out that survey. But it's not giving us what we call representative data that would allow us to make some estimates about how many people are in the community who pose a risk to children or who have harmed children. In the past, these sorts of nationally representative samples have been gathered through telephone survey research. But what we also find here is that even when the survey is anonymous and people are given a guarantee of anonymity, they are very reluctant to admit sexual interest in children or offending if they're speaking to someone verbally. So the challenge is we need a nationally representative sample, we need a large sample, and if it's nationally representative, we need to know some demographic characteristics about the people filling out the survey, but not so much that we can't guarantee them anonymity. And there's been surveys going back to the 1970s, which finds that when men are told that the survey is anonymous, they will admit to illegal sexual acts, both sexual assault of adults and also sexual offences against children. So that's quite a consistent pattern over 50 years of research. Men will be honest about this if they know that there's no chance that this will result in a criminal investigation. So we undertook this project with the aim of conducting a rigorous analysis of the prevalence of child sex offending amongst Australian men, and also what are the correlates? What can we find out about men who have harmed children or may pose a risk to children? So prevalence, looking at robust statistical profiles of undetected offenders and men at risk, and also looking at attitudes and online behaviours that might facilitate offending. We developed the survey. We used a number of survey measures that have already been validated. We also had to develop some of our own measures. This is quite a pioneering survey, but we could then use our own data to validate those measures. We worked on the survey with the Project Advisory Group, and we did get ethics approval from the university. It took a little bit of time, but we did get over the line. So in terms of the survey questions, we got demographic information. We asked about their online behaviours, what sort of activities they do online. We asked about health and well-being, including adverse childhood experiences. We asked about attitudes to children, and sorry for that terrible acronym, but particularly technology-facilitated child sexual exploitation. We asked them about whether or not they thought it was okay to abuse children online and in what circumstances. We asked about their pornography use and also their access to child sexual abuse material. I'm going to say CSAM from now on, but what we're talking about is child sexual abuse material, what used to be referred to as child pornography. We asked about sexual feelings towards children and also online and offline sexual behaviours towards children. The survey company that we used, and I'll touch on that in a moment, themselves, they had a number of sort of quality control measures in place to screen out people who are not honest when they answer surveys. We also had attention checks in our survey. So it's quite a long survey. It took about 30 minutes to fill out. And throughout the survey, we had attention checks to make sure that people were paying attention to the survey. So the attention check would say something like, you need to answer this question blue. What is your favorite color? And then it would list lots of colors. And if you didn't click blue, then we basically kicked you out of the survey. At the end of the survey, there was also an honesty check where we just asked people if they'd been honest during the survey. And if they said they hadn't been honest, then we also kicked them out of the survey. There is research behind this which finds that even if people have been dishonest in filling out a survey, that the honesty check is a good way to detect dishonesty, and people for some reason are honest in the honesty check. I don't know why, but they are. So how do we do this? So Cloud Research is an online survey recruitment platform. So people nominate into Cloud Research and they receive a small amount of money in return for filling out surveys, somewhere between $4 to $6. They have a large pool of participants, so 1.5 million participants. So what we're able to do was to ask Cloud Research to push our survey out to their pool of participants. We asked for 1,500 men in Australia, and also we have equivalent samples in the US and the UK. Now, I'm only going to present the Australian data today, but we have comparative data, and that's something that makes this survey actually quite powerful because we're able to look at different rates of offending between different jurisdictions and also look at what explains those differences in multivariate analysis. So we have a whole series of papers coming out of the survey over the next year or two that are going to be, I think, quite exciting in terms of their insights. So we could benchmark the men that came into the survey against Australian census data. But then once we had the raw data, we then conducted some, what I'm going to call statistical magic to then improve the fit between the raw data and the Australian census. The data that came in was actually pretty good, but there was a couple of variables that were a little bit off that we made some adjustments. So in fact, in total, we had almost 2,000 Australian men and then 1,500 in the US and the UK. So a couple of limitations. The recruitment relied on a pool of survey participants who had already nominated in. So it's not what we call a probability strategy, basically. It relied on convenience sampling. Within that, we got a representative sample. But frankly, to create a non-probability sample would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, which we don't have. And it also makes it impossible for us to guarantee anonymity to the participants if we went about it that way. And so this was really the only way that we could do the study. There's always a risk of people who are just speeding through the survey and clicking any button in order to just get the money at the end. Or people who are lying to us. That's always a risk, but as I mentioned, there was a number of quality control measures in place. We used 18 as the age of consent across all offence categories, both online and offline. Some of you will know that contact offending in Australia, the age of consent varies between 16 to 17, but in the United States, it actually varies up to 18. There's some states in the US where the age of consent is 18. The other issue for us is that this is a question about lifetime prevalence. And so over the last 50 years, the age of consent for some sexual acts just in Australia alone has varied between 16 and 21. So there's really no way for us to, with 100% accuracy, identify the specific criminal status of every act that was recorded in our sample. This is less of an issue for the online offences, most of which 18 is the age of consent, but not in all jurisdictions. So for example, in the United Kingdom, it's not grooming if you engage in sexual interactions with a 17-year-old, but if they send you an image, that's illegal, for example. So for some individuals, there's been criticism of the survey that what we've captured is a lot of 19-year-olds who are describing consensual sex with 17-year-olds. What I can tell you is that that is not what we have identified in the survey. If it was, I'd tell you, but that is not a fit of our data. The men who only, in our survey, the men who indicated that they had only had sexual contact with the child and they had no other indicator of risk were all 65 and above. And so if what we were capturing was a lot of men who were reporting consensual sex in their late teens, early 20s, we should see that skew young. It in fact skewed very old. The vast majority of men who reported contact offending were also either sexually interested in children or offending online. But also the rate of contact offending is not particularly high in this study, as we'll see in a moment. It's actually in line with other studies. Okay, so let's get into some of the findings. So men with sexual feelings towards children, when you do sensitive sex research, you need to ask the same question a number of different ways in order to come to a clear understanding of the phenomenon. So we asked people if they had sexual feelings towards people under the age of 18, and only 3.4% of people said yes. But once we started to ask questions such as, would you have sexual contact with a child between 12 to 14? 5.7% of men said yes. 10 to 12, 4.6%. Younger than 10, 4% of men said that they would. Do you have concerns about your sexual feelings towards people below the age of 18? 4.5% said yes, that they did have concerns. We also gave men a slider. So on the screen, we just said, what's the lowest age that you typically find attractive? We gave them a little slider that they could move across the screen, and they could take that slider under the age of 18, and 5.7% of men did that. So around 1 in 6 men were indicated as having sexual feelings towards children. So men who have offended against children, we asked 5 questions to determine this. And this was a binary choice. So we're asking if over the age of 18, you engaged in any of these behaviours relating to people under the age of 18. I want to be really clear, we did not gather information on sexually harmful behaviours from peers to peers. So there's nothing in our data about a 14-year-old, for example, sexually abusing a 10-year-old. That is not data that we collected. We are just asking about over the age of 18, what you did to somebody under the age of 18. We asked whether or not over the age of 18, you started looking at pornographic material containing people below the age of 18. 2.5% of men said yes. Now, 4.2% of men indicated that they had done this when they were teenagers. And I'm including that because in future iterations of the survey, I think we'll change the way we ask this question. What we know is that the majority of men who look at CSAM start doing that as teenagers, actually. And so this 2.5% is almost certainly an underestimation, because the 4.2% of men who started looking at CSAM when they were children, a proportion of them are almost certainly continuing into adulthood. So in total, 6.7% of Australian men have intentionally viewed CSAM. Over 4% have flirted or had sexual conversations with a child. Almost 2% have either webcammed in a sexual way with a child or paid for online sexual interactions or content of a child. So this is really important. This is actually the first prevalence data that we have in Australia on the rates of child sexual exploitation for money. And about 3.2% acknowledged having sexual contact with a child when they were an adult. So just under 1 in 10 men were indicated as having sexually offended against a child. So what we're going to do now is just look at some correlates of this behavior. And I apologize that it's a bit of a data dump. We'll just be moving through different statistical correlates. And I think for people who are new to the survey, if you haven't read the research report that was circulated, I will stop to try and make sense of the data as we go, and we'll also obviously have the chance for some conversation at the end of the discussion as well. So we created 4 categories of men out of our data. So 80% of men in Australia have no sexual feelings towards children they haven't offended. 10% report sexual feelings, but no sexual offending. And we have about 10% of men that have offended, and about half, a little under half of those men report no sexual feelings, but they have offended. And the other half report sexual feelings and sexual offending. Now, we have so much data that for the report, and in the data that comes, I focus on category 4, men with sexual feelings who have offended. But I think category 3 is really important. For a long time, my clinical colleagues who work with offenders have talked about a group of men who have harmed children, but in treatment, they don't seem to actually have any sexual interest in children. Now, I've always been pretty skeptical of that. There's lots of reasons why an offender will deny sexual interest in children. And at the moment, we are seeing criminal cases where offenders have downloaded CSAM, masturbated to it, sexually abused children, and then deny that they have any sexual interest in children. And they have a vested interest in doing that because what they want to do is present themselves as less of a risk to children. Nonetheless, what is interesting here in our data is that category 3 is demographically indistinguishable from category 1. They look actually identical to other men in the community. Whereas once men have sexual feelings, they do start to look quite different from men in the community, primarily because of adverse childhood experiences, which we'll talk about in a moment. So we're doing some more work to sort of dig into this analysis to really distinguish between offenders with sexual feelings and men without feelings. But I think from a prevention point of view, category 3 is really an important signal for us around opportunities for prevention. If these men are not particularly motivated to harm children, but instead there's a situational contributor, there might be alcohol and drugs, there might be other risk factors around sexual entitlement and so on. I think they're a real key opportunity for us, particularly institutional prevention, if they're not particularly sexually motivated. Now, for men who with sexual feelings who have sexually offended against children, so bearing in mind that is category 4, that's that 4.9%. This was a really concerning group of men for us because once we started to look at their statistical correlates, it starts to present, let's say, a kind of a profile. I think the top line concern for us is that these men were almost 3 times more likely to work with children compared to men with no sexual feelings who have not offended against children. So they're much more likely to be employed in roles where they're in direct contact with children. They are much more likely to live in the city. And we found this consistently across the data, is actually sexual offenders much more likely to report that they're living in urban or suburban areas, less likely to report that they live in regional or rural areas. Again, I don't know why that is, but that was very consistent across our data. They were also more likely to be married. So when we look at some of the forensic psychological literature that describes these men as incapable of romantic relationships with adults, as loners and so on, that is not in our data. That's not in our data for this 4.9% of men, more likely to be married. And they were not less likely to have a child in the house, actually. Some evidence that actually they were more likely to have a child in the house as well as being married. So we'll look at this in more detail in a moment. Now, they did have higher scores, sort of a horseshoe effect around anxiety and depression. So particularly moderate anxiety and depression, but more likely to have severe anxiety and depression. And a range of possible reasons for this, but something that I would propose is that if you're living with sexual feelings towards children and you've committed illegal acts against children, I imagine that's pretty stressful. And I imagine you probably feel pretty bad about yourself, actually. So I do wonder if the mental health effects that we're seeing here are not the product of essentially living a kind of a double life, but they also had elevated adverse childhood experiences scores. And we know that trauma is also a cause of anxiety and depression. They were also more likely to report weekly or daily consumption of alcohol. So they were more likely to be drinking to excess compared to men who are not abusing children and don't have feelings. Also more likely to report ever using illegal drugs. We only had a lifetime sort of prevalence screen for illegal drugs. We didn't ask a lot of questions about their drug use, but they were 2.5 times more likely to have ever used illegal drugs. This was a really interesting finding for us, and again, I think really concerning. Of those 4 categories that I presented to you, so men with no sexual feelings and no offending, men with sexual feelings only, men with sexual offending only, and then this group who have both feelings and offending, they had the highest social support scores. What that means is that their networks, right, their community connections were the strongest out of those 4 groups. They had the highest overall social support scores. They had the highest relationship satisfaction. They were saying that actually their relationship with their intimate other, their significant other, was very good. and they reported high social support from friends. Now, in comparison, men with sexual feelings who had not offended had lower social support scores. Now, for men who have sexual feelings towards kids but haven't offended, one of the pieces of advice that they're sometimes given is, and sometimes the theories that we hear from forensic psychologists is, make sure that you're not lonely, make sure that you've got hobbies, make sure that you've got good relationships and so on. And that makes a certain amount of sense. But our concern here is that these men are actually socially really connected. People like them and people trust them, despite the fact that they're abusing children and they have sexual interest in children. So this starts to present a picture of a kind of a premeditated offender who has access to children, and people would find it difficult to believe that they were a risk to children. So adverse childhood experiences, this group of men, so sexual feelings who have offended against children, had 2 times higher overall adverse childhood experiences scores than men did not have feelings. In fact, all of the adverse childhood experiences, all 10 of them, if you're familiar with the ACEs instrument, you've got 10 adverse childhood experiences. They were all statistically associated with this group, with the exception of divorce. So divorce was not statistically associated with this. We are not the first people to find this. In fact, the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and perpetration of child sexual abuse has been evident in the scholarship since at least the early 90s. So this is not a kind of a breakthrough insight. And I also want to emphasize that frankly, adverse childhood experiences is implicated in every negative criminal, psychosocial, behavioral outcome that you can imagine. Men with high adverse childhood experiences are more likely to engage in domestic violence, sexual assault against adults, physical assault of all kinds. And so again, the fact that we've found this association with perpetrating child sexual abuse, it does not mean that there's a kind of a simple pathway from, being abused as a child to perpetrating. We shouldn't be surprised that it increases risk, because it increases risk of all criminal behavior for boys and men. Yes, child sexual abuse was particularly indicated here, but you can see strong associations with neglect, domestic violence, living in a house with an incarcerated household member with a mental illness, and so on. So we've actually got a paper that's forthcoming looking at the entire 5,000 sample and looking at adverse childhood experiences across that sample. And what we find is that for the men who have experienced all 10 ACEs, so that's an exceptionally abused and neglected child. All 10 ACEs is just an egregiously awful childhood. 40% of those men, that's 40%, have sexually abused a child or committed a child sex offense. So there's really a dose-dependent relationship. The more adverse childhood experiences someone encounters throughout childhood, the higher the risk of child sex offending in adulthood. We asked a number of attitudinal questions, which we adapted from the child sexual abuse myth scale with a focus on online child sexual exploitation. And what we find is a relationship between sexual offending, sexual feelings, and these attitudes. They were greatest actually for men who had sexual feelings only, but very high for men with sexual feelings and offending. Again, we've just been doing some deeper dives into this data, and some really interesting findings have come out of this. So for men who have sexual feelings towards children, but they haven't offended, the attitudes that they endorsed in our study were what we call blame diffusion, where what they basically say is, it's okay to sexually abuse children online if you're drunk or alcohol affected. Maybe the child comes from a low-income family, and so then it's actually beneficial to give them money for sexual abuse. Children are sexually exploratory, and so it's not harmful when you do these things, and so on. So what we call blame diffusion, this was very acute for men with sexual feelings, but who haven't offended yet. So in a sense, what you can see them doing is grappling with the morality of what they want to do and what they're thinking about doing, right? And they're attributing blame to either alcohol and drugs or attributing blame to the child, but it's not the fault of the offender. For men who are offending against children, their attitude was primarily and overwhelmingly, they just denied that child sexual abuse was harmful. So they just denied that there was any harm to child sexual abuse. And then their blame diffusion scores dramatically dropped. They didn't particularly engage in blame diffusion once they were offending because they didn't need to. There's no blame to diffuse if you don't think that there's any blame to attribute, basically. So again, a really interesting analysis for us in terms of how the men create different defense mechanisms psychologically and different ways of legitimizing firstly, their sexual feelings, but once they are offending, they actually change sort of the psychic structure that they're using to hold the moral implications of their offending. So their internet use habits, these men were very, very active online and very engaged online. Now, remember that they're more likely to be married, but they're also more likely to be on dating and romance websites. And we asked specifically about whether or not they were paying subscription fees. So you can go on Tinder and it's free. There's sort of a free aspect of this, but we asked specifically, are you paying? Which makes you a much more serious user of dating sites. And if you're paying a subscription, then you're intending to meet people. What we also know is that, for example, the Australian Institute of Criminology came out recently with a survey which found that 10% of Australian adults who use dating sites, 10% have been asked for an image of their child by a stranger, and 5% have been asked for a naked or sexual image of their child by a stranger. We also know from the dark web, and I did quite a lot of research in the dark web, that offenders are strategizing to target single parents in particular using dating sites. And I think there's clear evidence of this here. These men were much more likely to be on dating sites. They were also much more likely to be on online gaming sites. And we know that that's where they can access children, and that's where they are accessing children. If we look at their social media sites, they're very active on social media and they're going where their kids are. So Instagram, Instagram in particular, very high use of Instagram. Now, Instagram is not a male skewed site. Instagram skews female and it skews young, and it's got a large number of teenage users, and that's exactly where these men were. But they were also preferentially much more likely to use encrypted social media sites as well. So real concerns for us about their use of not only social media, but their preferential use of encryption. And we'll talk about encryption more in one moment. So these men with sexual feelings who are offending against children, they're watching more pornography than other men. They're watching a lot more pornography, but the type of pornography that they're watching is of concern. Much more likely to watch violent pornography, so over 11 times more likely to watch violent pornography. Almost 17 times more likely to be purchasing online sexual content from adults, actually. So they're very active on things like OnlyFans, where they are getting content, images and videos from other adults for money. They were 27 times more likely to intentionally watch pornography involving animals. Why did we ask about bestiality? There's a number of reasons for this. In CSAM collections, when men are downloading child sexual abuse material, almost inevitably, they are also accessing animal content. Almost inevitably. Almost every CSAM collection will have animal content in it. I'm sorry to say this out loud, but this is important for you to know that some of the most popular, and I mean shared in its millions and millions every year, some of the most popular content of child sexual abuse material involves children who are forced into sexual contact with animals. And the reason why I am telling you that is because the community and many people in child safeguarding, when we talk about CSAM, you don't understand how egregious the material is. It is overwhelmingly prepubescent children being raped by adult men, being forced into extremely egregious and damaging acts. And so when we talk, or when the court talks about category 1 offending, that is the material that they are talking about. We've also seen discussions coming out of forensic psychology to the effect that being sexually attracted to children or being a pedophile, it's a sexual orientation equivalent to being homosexual or heterosexual. What I'm saying to you from this slide and from other aspects of our data is that men who are sexually interested in children have much broader and deviant sexual interests beyond children. They are aroused by very deviant content that doesn't involve children. And that it is important for us to understand these men as sexually sick, because that is what they are. And when we look at this sort of data, when we look at the range of material that they find arousing, they are sexually unwell. There is a sexual pathology at work here, and I think it's important that we hold that line, but that we also understand men who are looking at child sexual abuse material, if people in child protection don't understand how appalling this material is, and I know we all agree it's appalling, but it is much worse than people realize. This was a group of men who were significantly more likely to use any privacy service. So they were 3 to 6 times more likely to use encrypted social media apps. We asked about an app called Element. You've almost certainly not heard of it. Element is a distributed social media app from the UK. It is very locked down. It is distributed, it is encrypted, it is a black box. When we analyse our data, almost 90% of Australian men who use Element were either had sexual feelings towards children or were offending against children. And once we had this finding, we provided it to the Australian Federal Police, because at least in the Australian context, Element looks like a pedophile ring that you can download from the App Store. That's what it looks like to us. They were 2 times more likely to own cryptocurrency and 5.5 times more likely to use crypto for purchasing goods online. And you can imagine the sorts of content that they're using to purchase, that they're using crypto in order to purchase. It's very likely to be child sexual abuse material or content relating to children. Okay, so this is the last slide, and then we can move on to questions. So I've given you a lot of data, and some of you might be kind of reeling from some of that data. But what does this mean? So firstly, I think important messages around primary prevention. How do we reduce the rate of perpetration in Australia? Adverse childhood experiences. We need to keep children safe, frankly. And if we protect children now, then we stop this generation of perpetrators creating the next generation of perpetrators. There's issues around attitudes and attitudes to child sexual abuse. We need to be affirming to the Australian community that people who harm children are responsible for that harm, and that also child sexual abuse is harmful. It is injurious to children, because men who are at risk of harming children do not believe that. Encryption is an issue. Encrypted services, encrypted online services permit, facilitate, and encourage child sexual abuse. And broadly, adult pornographic content is also an issue here. There's no question about not only access to pornography, but the type of pornography is acting as a petri dish for sexual harm to children. So online regulation is extremely important, and that's really coming out in our cross-jurisdictional and comparative analysis. In the United States, which has far less online regulation than the other 2 jurisdictions, rates of sexual offending against children are higher, and that is directly attributable to their online environment, as well as other issues, including adverse childhood experiences, is higher in the United States than it is in Australia. So secondary prevention or early intervention, clearly at the institutional level, we have men with a sexual interest in children who are working with children. That's probably no surprise to anyone on this call. We also need early intervention for traumatized boys. When boys have been harmed, particularly sexually abused, but other sorts of harm, we need therapeutic early intervention for those boys, excuse me. And yes, we should be providing that support anyway, but it's also to prevent the future negative life outcomes, one of which may be sexual offending against children. We need to be much better at targeting boys and men who have deviant pornography consumption. They're looking at a lot of porn, they're looking at violent porn, they're looking at animal content. We need to kind of broaden the categories of people that we understand are sitting in sort of a risk profile for harming children. And we need services for people who are concerned about their sexual feelings or behaviours towards children. Remember, almost 1 in 20 men in Australia said they wanted help for their sexual feelings towards children. And at the moment, the only service for those men is a tiny little pilot study, unfunded pilot program being run by the good graces of Jesuit Social Services. That's all we've got in Australia. In terms of intervention and prosecution, we should expect that offenders are educated, they are of good character, they're married, people like them, people trust them, but they're living a double life. They are premeditated, they're using encryption, they're pursuing roles where they work with children, they are networking with one another. When offenders access child sexual abuse material, they are not just finding images and videos online, they are participating in online forums, discussion groups, social media channels full of other pedophiles. They're networking with one another, they are normalizing the abuse of children, they are encouraging each other to abuse children, and at times they are trafficking in children online. And that's a particular concern with many offenders living with children. And I've done a lot of work around the parental production of child sexual abuse material, but more broadly, the role of parents and caregivers as offenders against children. This was one of the largest categories of child sex offenders that was identified by the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which is our largest victimisation study. Parents and caregivers were actually the second largest group of offenders identified in the study. They do have a financial footprint. These are men, they're purchasing sexual services online, they're purchasing privacy services, and we can do more work to identify them through the banks. And my team is working with the banks on this. And obviously there are treatment implications here for working with this group of men. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I've talked for a long time. Really happy to have a chat about what this means and answer any questions you might have.
So I've had a couple of questions come through. I also had a couple of my own, and anybody else who's listening, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to keep putting them into the chat box. So one of mine that came up, and this came up very early when we were talking before the session actually, was whether or not there's any consideration for future studies that perhaps focus on women rather than just men, where there is quite a lot of studies that invest in men, but recently there's been some studies about women offenders in this space as well.
Yes, I think it's a great idea. We focus on men for a couple of reasons. They're the majority of offenders, and I think it's important to name that and draw on that. But if we were to do a survey with women, it would not be the same survey. The correlates and predictors for women's sexual offending against children are not the same as men's. And I think we make a mistake when we take explanations for offending behaviour that have been developed using kind of the male paradigm and data from men and just transpose it to women. So I think it's a good question. And it's something we'd be interested in doing, but also recognizing we have a much larger group of victims and survivors in the female population of sexual violence, both in childhood, but also in adulthood. So a lot of sensitivities there about going out to women and asking these sorts of questions. Not to say that they're not sensitive questions for men. So something for us to think about in terms of how we might start to tease out not just the prevalence and predictors of offending amongst women, but also starting to look at, I suppose, some of the attitudinal issues that we do come across when it comes to women's role in child sexual abuse. And it's not uncommon that we are encountering cases where, frankly, women might have turned the other cheek. They might have looked away. They might have colluded in offending. They might have been unprotective. That's not to blame them for the offending, but I think we might want to explore for women, what are some of the attitudinal and other reasons why women can sometimes be collusive or non-protective as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because I just thought of that as you were talking, and it's not just women, there's also a large proportion of men who may not have offended themselves, but didn't take the steps to make sure that that was followed through. That would be a really interesting kind of follow-up study. Okay, there's a new question that just came through. As an employer with responsibility for a system of schools, what additional due diligence checks can we undertake in recruitment processes? And then, as a mother of three, these statistics are terrifying, Chrissy, they really are.
Yeah, no, look, they are. But I think at the same time, we've got 1 in 4 Australian children are sexually abused before the age of 18. Somebody's doing it. And in that sense, there was always going to be a large proportion of men in the community that constitute some kind of risk. So we are sort of surfacing this, but I think it's an important conversation. I think in terms of those sort of screening processes, it's not particularly my area of expertise. I was meeting with the Office of the Children's Guardian a couple of days ago, and they were just talking about, what does it mean in a working with children check when it identifies a historical conviction from 30 years ago? Is that person still a risk to children? And these are really big and important and consequential questions in a range of different ways. I suppose what this really signals for me is what we've heard from victims and survivors for a long time, which is that a lot of offenders are very, very good at presenting really well. And how do we start to sensitize not just those initial, I suppose, screening and recruitment processes, but how can we better sensitize ourselves to the ways in which these grooming processes start to unfold in an institutional setting? Because that's really how these offenders get away with what they do, is grooming institutions, meeting all of the criteria, everybody liking them. So I'm not answering your question, but I think there's sort of an iterative process of safeguarding as we just continually check in with sort of the temperature of the institution and the overall climate and what's going on for kids.
Yeah. So they're popping in now. Marie has asked if you can explain more about the age of the 65 plus offenders.
So there is what we can see in our data is a situational effect. So there's been these long-term debates about contact offenders and non-contact offenders, offenders who are quote unquote only looking at child sexual abuse material. What we find is frankly situational, that the older offenders who were only reporting sexual contact with children but no online offending, they didn't know how to use a computer. Their online activity was much lower. They just had less technological aptitude. Whereas when we looked at the men who were offending in their 20s and 30s, and often it's very online offending or it's mixed offending, this is a highly technologically capable generation, frankly. And so what we're seeing is, I suppose, is just reflective of that, that men who were quote unquote contact only offenders were just older and less proficient with computers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All the questions are coming in now. Any prevention or awareness implications for higher education institutions with large numbers of younger men in online environments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we're having a lot of conversations about respectful relationships and consent and, even talking to young people about their exposure to pornography and so on and so forth. But I think there is a cohort that we're missing, which is a significant proportion of teenage boys who are looking at illegal content. They're actually looking at child sexual abuse material. Now, I think for the most part, they're doing it out of curiosity, what's the dark web, what's Tor, these sorts of things. But we're not speaking to those men about that at the moment. And we really need to. I think we're being a bit naive about what's happening for teenage boys. we talk a lot about radicalization. They're looking at Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, they're getting radicalized by these online men's rights groups. We've got a cohort of teenage boys being radicalized by online pedophiles. They're in forums and environments that are full of pedophiles who are saying that it's okay to do this to kids. In the United Kingdom, Stop It Now has resources and has set up programs for teenage boys to reach out if they're worried about what they're doing online. And I think we need to start moving in that direction so that we've got resources to meet young men where they're at, including where they have seriously stepped over a line, and they're looking at really disturbing material.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the name of the program?
Stop It Now in
Stop
the
It
UK.
Now.
Yeah, but they have just launched over the last 12 months a specific website for adolescents who are worried about what they're doing online or worried that they might be experiencing some sexual attraction to children.
That might be a good one. Kevin, that was your question. That might be a good one to have a look at, that program and what they're doing for some more information. So Taylor has asked, how do you foresee the investigation and prevention of child sexual abuse in the future? Are there any more safeguards being created?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that every time a child sex offender hits the criminal justice system and he's relatively well off and white collar and married and everyone likes him, and there's just a kind of a shock. And also he's got a lot of resources to defend himself, legally, socially, character references, these sorts of things. I think we need to normalize that is the sort of offender that we should be looking for. And I would like to see much more structured policy development away from, frankly, the low-hanging fruit, away from the men who are easy to catch, because that's who we're catching. We're catching the men who are easy to catch. I don't think we've put enough thought into how do we tangle with the professional middle-class man who's living a double life, who doesn't think that what he's doing is wrong, who thinks that society is wrong, who's part of sort of an online pedophile community, but he's also very good at covering his tracks. So again, I'm not answering your question, but I think we need to go through that process of thinking what are reasonable and effective policy measures, because we are behind the 8 ball there.
But I think that does answer the question, maybe not in the safeguards being created, but you can't really create the safeguards until you've kind of got the policy and that's coming through. So Llewellyn has said, in providing advice to the broader community, including parents, carers, and those who work with children about safeguarding, what would be relevant takeaways from this study and your previous work?
I think there's a couple of things here. I think, facilitating, just open, honest conversations with kids about the risk, about the realities. And obviously that's something that we need to do in a way that's attentive to kids' developmental stages and so forth. We need to be really honest that the internet's really unsafe. It is egregiously unsafe, and that is the fault of the technology sector, and that's the fault of governments who have been complicit in that for a really long time. But the sorts of standards that are in place in offline environments are absolutely not there in online environments. And we had a bath toy in Australia that was recalled because 6 kids cut themselves in the bath. And then we have online services where literally hundreds of thousands of children are sexually abused through that service every year and have been for years. And that service just continues to operate with no sanction and no change to their business model. So we need to be really honest with ourselves and with kids about that. I think the impulse to wrap kids in cotton wool until they're 18 is understandable, but really dangerous, because if we're not allowing kids to sometimes take risks, then they're going to keep secrets from us. And that is a great opportunity for an offender. And I think the other piece that we need to be honest about is the importance of sex education. This has become really politicized over the last couple of years in a range of ways. But we actually do need, again, developmentally appropriate sex education for children. It is preventative and protective, and something that I do say to groups like this and other community professional organizations is that some people might be squeamish about sex education for their kids, but sex offenders are not, and they will happily inform your children about sex if you don't want to. So I would prefer that we did.
Yeah, absolutely. I had another couple of questions on the side, but none of them we need to go through now because we are out of time. I might send them through to you in an email and just get some responses, and we can upload those into the system for people if they want to see that later. There is one more message that's come through. Oh, sorry, one from Barbara. Do you have time to quickly go through one more? Yeah. Do you see public campaigns as a primary preventative strategy on raising awareness or an increased program such as Stop It Now? And how does Stop It Now compare to the German pilot Dunkfield project and the outcomes of self-identified abuse?
Yeah, so really good questions. Yes, I think that social marketing is important from a prevention point of view, and I would like it to be much more attitudinally focused on the attitudes that are legitimizing abuse. I think the government's gone very softly on an honest public conversation about child sexual abuse, and I question the efficacy of that. Because we have data in the UK, we have some evidence that Stop It Now has had a population level effect in the UK. There are risk indicators that are clear in the UK, in the US and Australian data set that are not there in the UK data set. And one potential explanation is because Stop It Now is doing its job. So I absolutely think that this is a service that we need and I really support. Dunkelfeld, I think is more controversial. And I've had this conversation very directly with the head of Dunkelfeld because actually they did a couple of things wrong. That included mixing contact offenders with CSAM offenders in their treatment program, and their own evaluation data showed that increased offending actually. So it's not as though it's not as though any treatment is good treatment. Some interventions with this population actually increase risk for children. So we do need to be really, really careful. And the other evaluations of Dunkelfeld have not been positive. At the same time, they are in a jurisdiction that doesn't have mandatory reporting. So the men can be very honest in their behaviours to Dunkelfeld in a way that Stop It Now in the UK can't actually track the efficacy of their work. So we're not we are comparing apples and oranges. But I would say, based on their data, I'm a bit of a Dunkelfeld skeptic, and I would be really concerned about their model being brought to Australia. Whereas I think Stop It Now has been much more cautious about their clinical model.
Great, thank you. I think that's answered everybody else's questions, so I think that we can probably leave it there and let you go. I just want to say thank you so much. I never thought I would say that a presentation like this would be interesting, because it shouldn't be interesting. It shouldn't be something that we want to hear about, but it really was, and it was really good to hear the findings of the report, and also for you to be so clear about the limitations of the studies. So you are limited to those with core, which means there's a huge portion of people who are just not captured by this study, and it's really good to know those limitations up front. So again, thank you very much. I'm assuming that I'm speaking on behalf of everyone when I say that I enjoyed it and they did as well. And yeah, we'll get this material up, and I believe that you're going to send through the PowerPoint. We can get that up for people to see as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, folks.